Thank you all for being here this morning. I'm Marina Salandy-Brown, and I'm the festival director, and very, very pleased to welcome you all to this session of the NGC Bocas Lit Fest. We're here because of Afua Hirsch. Lorna Goodison was meant to be in this session, but Lorna couldn't be here because of an illness in her family. But we were very, very happy that Afua could stand in this session, because Afua is going to be discussing, I think tomorrow. On Sunday, we're going to be having a session about the Windrush generation. And of course, you're not part of the Windrush generation, but she's written a lot about it in Britain. Her book really is, could be about the Windrush generation. It is about the generation in part, yeah. And in case none of you know anything about the Windrush generation, unless you've been living under a stone, the Windrush generation, the people who went after the war, 1948, to Britain in a large ship called the Windrush, and they landed in Tilbury in 1948. And their children have stayed on, and many of them have stayed on, and they've helped build post-World War II Britain. And recently, they fell foul of some very dodgy immigration rules. And, well, you all know, there's a lot of been brouhaha about it. Meanwhile, we've been actually breaking UN rules, apparently, getting rid of Venezuelan immigrants willy-nilly. So this is all a very, we're very close to Venezuela, and we've had a lot of people coming here because of what's been going on over there. And we've come a little bit unstuck as well. So all of this is very relevant to what's going on around us. Afua and I will have a chat, and she will read, maybe in between, or would you like to read all in one go?
Yeah, maybe in between.
Okay, in between. And at the end, we'll have a conversation, and we'll then ask you to join in with us. Afua, is that correct way to pronounce it?
Yes, that's excellent.
Afua Hirsch is a writer, broadcaster, and also a barrister who has worked in the area of human rights. She works mainly as a journalist and was the UK Guardian's legal affairs and West African correspondent and a social affairs editor for Sky News. Now she's written a book that is hot off the press. It's called British, on Race, Identity, and Belonging. It's published by Jonathan Cape this year. So it's really hot off the press. And she's fresh from causing a stir in the United Kingdom with her plain-talking, honest, and often quite touching personal investigation into what it's like to be a person of color living in Britain today. She's not of Caribbean origin, although she looks like it. And everything she has to say about the subject of identity, race, and belonging relate completely to anybody of Caribbean origin living in Britain, or elsewhere, actually. So please to help me welcome Afua to Trinidad. And to this literary festival. Afua, I want to start finding out a little bit about where you come from, because one of the things in your book, which I've read cover to cover now, is that people kept asking you where you're from.
Yeah.
And you thought, well, where am I from? So where did you discover you're from?
Yes, I write about what I call in my book the question, which is this question of where are you from? And the reason that I call it the question is because if you are a person of colour in Britain, it doesn't matter how British you are. Or like me, I've lived my whole life in Britain, I've had a British passport from birth. I've never been asked the question, where are you from, more anywhere in the world than in Britain, where I am from. And it's often this very well-intentioned question from people who are genuinely curious about your heritage. You know, racist people don't usually ask where you're from, they just tell you to fuck off back there, you know, they're not interested in the details. So it's these kind of well-meaning, well-intentioned people. But the cumulative effect on a young person growing up in Britain who is British, of being asked constantly where you're from, is that you think, oh, well, there must be an answer, you know, because if I were British people wouldn't keep asking me. And in my case, I decided that the answer was Ghana, because my mother's family came to Britain from Ghana. And my father is white British with some Jewish German heritage. But it was my Ghanaian heritage that made me visibly different, which was the reason I was getting asked this question. So I think when you start to give someone an answer to a question, you start to believe the answer. And then I convinced myself that I am Ghanaian. And so then going to Ghana became the answer to all my problems of identity and feeling. And this is what so relates to the Windrush generation, this issue of being a British person, having always been a British person, but always somehow feeling excluded from Britishness, whether that's through bureaucracy or whether it's just from kind of regular acts of othering or comments or microaggressions or well-meaning questions that give you the sense of coming from somewhere else. So my life, in a way, has been a journey into trying to answer that question for myself. And the realization that identity, belonging, it's not a place. There is no place I can go that's going to solve these questions. That it's a sense of self-acceptance and embracing your heritage and what you believe in and what you're about. So in a way, my book is the product of my life searching for those answers.
And what did your father think about you deciding that you were Ghanaian? Because if you were Ghanaian, you weren't all the things that he is.
Yes, there's a scene in my book, which some people have found quite shocking, where when I was about 14, I said to my parents, we were in the kitchen in our house, and I said, as a black woman, and my parents both kind of froze, and I think my mother nearly dropped the plate she was holding, because it had never occurred to them that I would self-identify as a black woman. And that's because my mother was born in Ghana, which is a country where the majority of people are black, and she's a black woman, and therefore race was not her primary identity. There's not a word for black in Ghana, it's just normal. And my father is white in a country where the majority are white, and so race is also not his primary identity. So neither of my parents had these particularly racialized experiences, and I think they were not equipped to understand the reality of a person growing up as a minority in a country that constantly regards you as not quite legitimate. And I was always the black girl in my environment growing up, and I internalized that. And I made it a positive thing eventually, and I'm very proud of my black heritage, and I do self-identify as a black woman. But it was very shocking for my parents because it had never occurred to them that I would see myself that way. So to answer your question, I think it's been a journey for my father as well.
And what about his parents?
My father grew up in Sevenoaks, which is a very white,
Kent.
leafy part of suburb Kent. It's kind of the countryside, but close to London. My father did not know that he was of Jewish heritage until he graduated from university and his degree results were published in the Jewish Chronicle. The Jewish Chronicle just kind of scoop up anyone with a Jewish surname and publish their degree results. And the reason is that my grandfather was a refugee from Nazi Germany in 1939. And like many refugees, he was very deeply traumatized by his experience of fleeing, of growing up in a world where his rights were steadily diminished and then having to flee and leave everything. And so many of his family died in the Holocaust. And he coped with it by never speaking about it. And he married an English woman, my grandmother. And this is the thing I think that as a child I noticed, both sides of my family are descended from immigrants. But my grandfather was able to assimilate into Englishness. Nobody ever asked my grandfather where he was from. Nobody ever asked his children where they were from. They were able to assimilate into Britishness and into whiteness. My mother's family, although actually they probably came from a more upper class family in Ghana, they were and will always be immigrants. My grandmother, who is 89, has suffered from racist abuse her whole life in the UK. My mother and her siblings are all successful professionals who regularly experience these often microaggressions, kind of my mum taking her secretary out for lunch and the restaurant always giving the bill to the secretary, never occurring to them that my mother could be the employer in the situation. Those kind of things have been very constant features of their life. And so for me growing up, I also had to reconcile why these two sides of my family that in many ways had a similar history had such different experiences of Britain and Britishness.
Or based on skin colour.
Yes, based on skin colour. So I became very interested in my father's heritage as well, and I've learned a lot more about that, and I write about it in the book. But my parents, I think this is the positive thing about the book. When I wrote this book and my parents read it, they then started sharing their experiences that they had never ever shared. And I think that's partly because they didn't have a space in which, as kind of middle-class professional people, they could express these alienations.
I think your parents are probably my age, and it was a very different time then. It wasn't, all the things that happen now to people of colour didn't really happen then. It wasn't such a big issue until the laws started changing from about 68, 78, a succession of immigration laws just made things worse and worse and worse. There was a time where it was trendy in the 60s to see mixed couples.
Yes, and that's when my parents met.
Yeah.
But I think that when you drill down, there have been experiences, and there has been hostility. It's just that there wasn't even a vocabulary to express it. You know, like now my mother, since reading my book, keeps going, "Gosh, I realise I feel very othered by that."
Yeah.
You know, I just never in a million years would have heard my mother say that before.
There's a new category.
It is, and you know, even for me, I went to university at Oxford, and it was a very difficult experience. And it, you know, it's a huge privilege to study there. But as a person of colour, it's a very hostile place. And I went for my book to interview some young women of colour who are students there now. And during this interview, they shared experiences with me that were basically identical to things that had happened to me when I was there. You know, being ID carded to go into your own college when, you know, white students come and go freely. Just these kind of daily experiences that give you a sense of not being accepted as a member of this institution. And they were depressed that I had had the same experiences and that nothing had changed. But I was encouraged because they have names for these things. You know, they were talking about POCs and microaggressions and imposter syndrome. If I'd have had a name for imposter syndrome when I was at university, it would have changed my life. Because I experienced it, but I didn't know it was a thing. I thought there was something wrong with me, which is what imposter syndrome is. And they also are organising, they're mobilising. You know, they've got Roads Must Fall, they've got Why Is My Curriculum White? So I see a huge amount of agency in this generation, and the things that have been going on since my Ghanaian grandfather went to Cambridge in the 1940s, and when I found his letters in the archive at his college, and it just resonated with me, what he went through so clearly. So these same things have been going on for generations, but now there is a sense of confidence in challenging them and calling them out.
And maybe because, too, that before 1960, well, in 48, there was a generation of people who came and they went to certain areas, but they weren't so integrated right across society. But then what happened with the generation of the 60s that came after, you know, Uganda and all of that, was that there were many more people integrated, now spreading out right across society. So there was a more joined up response. But this is a beautifully written book on which she draws on personal experience, on research, a lot of research. I would like you to read from it now, please, so you can get a tone of the writing and of the story.
I'm going to read from the beginning of the book, which it gives you a flavour of some of the personal stories, as well as the bigger themes. So the first chapter is the introduction, and it's called Identity Lessons. On a Friday evening in October 2004, with the nights drawing in and the layers piling up over summer clothes, I was sitting cross-legged in the living room of my friend Miranda's house in East London. I had recently returned from living in Senegal, one of the last frontiers of Africa before it stabs into the Atlantic Ocean to the west and melts into the Sahara Desert in the north. 2 years earlier, I'd barely had time to say goodbye to these university friends. I'd given myself a few days to recover from the exhaustion of my final exams, packed 2 large suitcases, then boarded an Air France flight, 21 years old, impatient to begin the journey into my new African identity. It was a journey that had been years in the planning. The friends gathered around on this autumn night had treated my return much as they had treated my departure, curious but unsurprised. I came bearing stories of unpredictable work in countries that most British people have barely heard of: Chad, Burkina Faso, Sao Tome, of trying to hold meetings with government ministers in languages I could barely speak, of only just surviving cerebral malaria, of smuggling suitcases of cash into war zones. My friends, deep in the hustle of London's graduate job market, pointed out how fortunate I was to be able to decorate my CV with this kind of experience. But that had never been the reason for going. I hadn't left Britain to become an expat with a competitive advantage in the job scrum. I had left Britain to leave being British. I believed that relocating my future to one or more of Africa's many nations would solve the problems of belonging that had nibbled away at me, a mixed-race girl growing up in Britain for as long as I could remember. I had not meant to come back, not after 2 years, not ever, but to settle in West Africa for good and take up my place in the world as a proud African in places where I thought I would fit in. Exactly the opposite had happened. Living in Senegal, I had discovered, to my endless confusion, how British I was. Returning to London meant the relief of familiarity, of home, but the painful reminder that home was a place that had surveyed me as an alien, questioned me about my background, and expected me to provide explanations, Very little, it seemed, had changed. Evenings like this in the little house that marked the beginning of a steep staircase of Victorian terraces descending down to the River Lee and the bleak London marshland beyond were different. These friends and I, a group of black, mixed race and other misfit Oxford graduates, sitting in a loose circle on the carpet, were bonded by the fact that none of us had ever really fitted in. So we would congregate there, feasting on vegan food, painfully aware of the cliches and contradictions that we embodied, trying to work out the point of it all. I'd longed for this companionship while I'd been away, and the rhythms of our London lives, the quirkiness of our homes and our clothes and our seasons, the cynicism and sarcasm of our humour. Now I was back in the midst of these traditions and drinking them in like warm tea. I was in love with a man I'd met not long before, Sam, who lived just a mile away from Miranda in Tottenham, a part of London he always described as the hood. This environment had shaped him into a person unlike any I had ever met before, and having returned to it from a northern university where he'd spent the last 3 years getting a law degree, he now clerked at a solicitor's firm during the day, saving up money before starting the vocational course to become a barrister. He spent each evening after work on the athletics track near White Hart Lane, where he trained as a sprinter, lumps of lactic acid laying themselves onto his thighs hour upon hour. Unlike any other 24-year-old I knew, Sam had his own car, a source of independence which he spent years working, and he was always on the move late at night, plugging away at the personal development books he credited with sparing him the same fates as his friends. It never ceased to shock me how many of the people he grew up with were in jail, in and out of mental institutions, or stuck in minimum wage jobs. And in his community, he seemed to know everyone. That night, Sam was visiting a school friend who lived on a nearby council estate further up Miranda's Road, a sprawl of decaying social housing at the top of the hill. Neither of us could have known that this was the last time Sam would visit. Just a few weeks later, his friend was dead, caught up in crossfire from a turf war. These weren't innocent times. His friend was already getting slowly drawn into the drug trade, the one local industry that provided many jobs. But for a few hours that evening, it was like the old days, before Sam had gone away to university and left his friends behind, just hanging out with the boys on the block, catching up. Since he was so close by, Sam offered to pick me up from Miranda's house and drive me home to Wimbledon, where I lived, around 17 miles across town. Just before midnight, he rang the doorbell. The scene had already played itself out in my mind. I was excited about introducing my friends to this man they had heard so much about. I pictured him coming in, joining our little circle, sharing some tofu cheesecake. That, however, is not how it went down. Miranda opened the door, and Sam said hello to her, cautiously, as he stepped through that front door and into the room with the big bay window, the cluttered piano. Once inside, he stopped dead, as if in shock, and stared. He shifted from foot to foot, mumbling hello, and gazed around in bewilderment, taking it all in. Sam, so confident, so uneasily fazed, was quiet and perplexed. In all his life, he told me later, he had never seen a scene like this one. People talking so earnestly, almost conspiratorially, in low, hushed voices, even eating the way we were eating, an array of strange plant foods being pushed around on little plates. 13 years later, we still talk about that day. You lot, sitting there with your herbal tea all round in a circle, nah, Sam shakes his head. That blew my mind, and I thought I'd seen it all. What was so strange about it, I ask. You don't understand. He shakes his head again. This area's hood, you know. People getting shot in the area, man them on the hustle, and you lot were sitting there oblivious, all huddled around. In Wimbledon, yeah, fine, but in my area, you're still behaving the same way. I would never, in all these years growing up around here, have known that that scene could have existed in this area. There was something else that bothered Sam at the time. He had his own preconceptions about my group of friends. He knew we had been to Oxford and that many of us were privately educated, some at elite boarding schools. Now we had our degrees in the bag, a kind of uniform privilege that, as far as he was concerned, meant that success was guaranteed for us with as much certainty as failure was guaranteed for most of the people around him. Listen, in my brain, you lot went to Oxford. You are supposed to be the creme de la creme. You're supposed to be blitzing this life. And there you were sitting around so tentative-like, so unsure of yourselves. Trust me, if a man like me had the opportunities you had, there'd be no stopping me. We'd be up in this country making some serious money. We'd be running things instead of sitting around all quiet. Conversations with Sam still go like this.
Thank you. And did you notice in her reading that her accent changed? There's actually a South London, a black South London accent.
That's
What's it
North
called?
London, actually.
Is that North? Well, there's a North and a South.
It's actually called, it's got a name, it's called MLE, which is Multicultural London English. And if you read certain British newspapers, they kind of run these scare headlines, MLE taking over Britain, true English is being lost to the urban scourge.
Well,
So,
you know, we both worked in the media, and you worked for the BBC for a while, which
Yeah.
I did too. And I remember the BBC, before she mentions some of these things in the book, that Greg Dyke became the director of the BBC. And he picked up on, they had a diversity policy, because what the BBC had discovered is that the people who were most growing in population size were ethnic minorities. But the people who least liked what the BBC were doing were the ethnic minorities. So there was a big sort of yawning gap between the BBC reaching them and the numbers. So the BBC had to do something. They came up with a diversity policy. And it was interesting that they had somebody called a czar, a diversity czar. And this diversity czar sat in a meeting with me one day, and I argued that we should have more people of color on the radio. And she said, what does it matter when you can't see their color? And of course, this must have been about at least 15 years ago, because 15 years ago, because then this MLE did not exist. I didn't have that argument, and I said I had another way of responding to her.
Well,
but
it's complicated, because I think that's where race and class intersect, because the people of colour that are on the BBC don't speak MLE.
No.
They speak like me.
Yeah.
And, you know, the BBC is doubly unlikely to make visible people who are of Afro-Caribbean heritage and from working class backgrounds. And if you actually break it down, it's really interesting, because women of South Asian heritage are actually overrepresented on the BBC.
Yes, they are.
Men of African and Caribbean heritage are the least represented.
Absolutely,
group on the BBC. So there are some really, and that's part of my problem with the approach to diversity in Britain. This idea that there's this kind of BAME, they call it BAME, Black and Minority Ethnic, is kind of this blob of brown people, that we're all the same. And, you know, we have this kind of BAME identity, and if you can just put a few of us in visible positions, then you've solved.
But one of the issues that you raise in the book is the way in which race and class are very difficult to divide.
Yes.
Would you like to talk a little bit about that? Because, yeah. I mean, yeah.
Yes, so Britain is a class society. So to a huge extent, opportunity, privilege, advantage is distributed by class. We have these ways of talking about class. So we talk about white working class people as white working class, kind of assuming that black people are working class anyway, whereas kind of there's something weird about white people being working class. So there's already a kind of very skewed way of looking at it. People of black African heritage account for 50% of households in poverty. They're hugely overrepresented in poverty, in the underclass. And this whole Windrush story as well is about the kind of ways in which the system has pushed people from the former empire into undocumented, insecure, low security, low wage, poor housing conditions. Because by denying them these rights and by denying them the kind of bureaucracy of their entitlement to Britain, you take away their ability to hold landlords and employers and other parts of the British system to account. So it's interesting, and it's quite complicated, because a lot of the black immigrants to Britain were not working class people. As we know, a lot of the Windrush era, you know, they were educated, they had skills and professions and aspirations. The people who get on boats tend to be the people who are going places. The Africans who came to Britain in the 60s and 70s were often professional and educated as well. We created a black working class by the systemic ways in which we denied black people opportunity and advantage in Britain. And so now black people are heavily overrepresented in working class groups. If you look at unemployment, young black men account for double the unemployment rate of their white peers. So 20% of young white men from working class backgrounds are unemployed. It's 40% for young black men from the same socioeconomic background. So there's a huge crossover in the sense that black people have been pushed into working class and underprivileged groups.
And they've also been criminalized, because one of the things you also mention in the book is the enormous number of stop and search incidents among minority people.
I cannot communicate enough how racist the dialogue around crime and policing is in Britain. There is this such deeply ingrained assumption about black criminality that people will tell you with a straight face that the only way to bring crime down is to harass black boys, children, children on their way to buy a pint of milk for their mother, children on their way home from school, children on their way to work experience. And even though only 1 in 10 stop and searches overall results in a crime being detected. The figure for white people is 1 in 8. The figure for black people is 1 in 18. So by stopping and searching black people, you are statistically less likely to detect a crime. That hasn't stopped black people being 5 times more likely to be stop and search. If you look at school exclusions, in Britain, young black boys are 168 times more likely to be excluded from school than young white boys.
168.
168. And that is an entry point into the criminal justice system, because once you get excluded from school, you get sent to a school for permanently excluded children, which is called a PRU, where they regard getting 1 GCSE as a result. It's kind of the lowest expectation. The resources, they've privatized them, they're profit-making, companies are making huge profits out of them, and it's seen as kind of like crowd control rather than education. And the minister in the current government joked that we should start building prisons next to these schools to shorten the distance that children have to travel to. And he thought that was funny. So it's sometimes surreal to listen. I do a lot of TV debates, I do a lot of current affairs debate shows, and you often have these arguments about whether racism exists, whether race matters. And it's surreal because it's not a debate. You look at any set of statistics, it bears it out very clearly, but the levels of denial are profound. And that's what we see happening with Windrush. It's kind of being turned into this like administrative error by the Home Office.
One of the things that you pick up a lot and in your book is, and it's something that's always shocked me too about American society, is how little they know of their history.
Yes.
I mean, people in Britain know about the abolition of slavery. They know
Yes.
very little actually about the slavery.
Yes.
So you did a lot of work on that.
Yes.
Would you like to talk a little bit
Yes.
about what you discovered?
It's kind of, the only way I can describe it really is a psychosis, because how can you as a nation celebrate abolishing something without acknowledging the thing that you created that you needed to abolish? So that's what Britain does. If you raise a point about slavery, any British politician will immediately respond by citing the name William Wilberforce. And the bicentenary of the abolition of the transatlantic slave trade was a huge celebration in Britain. We minted special coins, had a lovely church service at Westminster Abbey, the Queen was there, and it's this kind of feel-good thing. We abolished the slave trade. A lot of British people genuinely feel that we should be proud of our role as the nation that abolished the transatlantic slave trade. The same people have no idea that Britain essentially invented the transatlantic slave trade, that every British monarch from Queen Elizabeth I used their personal private wealth to fund slave trading voyages, that our entire banking institution, our system of legal jurisdiction, everything was designed to facilitate the needs of planters. Our entire economy was dependent on sugar imports. These are really basic historical facts. And it's incredible how much amnesia there is towards them. And then even if you accept that abolition was something to celebrate, which is debatable because there is, as I'm sure many of you know, a long-standing argument as to whether it really was driven by humanitarian concerns or whether it was an economic necessity. But even if you accept how significant the abolition of transatlantic slave trade was, the only name most British people will tell you is William Wilberforce. And there's this idea that abolition was this kind of act of charity handed down to these wretched Africans by this lovely posh white man. The reality of abolition is that there were Africans who were born into slavery, who became literate campaigners, published authors, agitators, advocates, who achieved the abolition of slave trade through their life's work, and their names are not marked on any plaques or any museums.
In Britain?
Or any curriculum. Yes, it's remarkable. And it's very hard to escape the conclusion that this is all accidental. When you look at history in the round and our relationship with it, you find this systematic erasure of the role of black people in British history. You find this obsessive promotion of figures like William Wilberforce, who people feel can be celebrated. And it's very easy to trace where this comes from. Every single one of our political leaders for the last 20 years has spoken of history in Britain as a celebratory subject. When you take that as your starting point, you know that you are not going to be looking at the empire in any kind of honest way. You're not going to be analysing the slave trade or the impact it's had on the British economy or the socioeconomic situation of black people in Britain. So anything that doesn't fit in this narrative of celebration is completely whitewashed. And I think personally that has a lot to do with the Second World War as well, because Britain has this view of itself as the nation that was on the right side of history. And it's made it very difficult to create a space in which to show British people that Britain was on the wrong side of history for 400 years.
On that particular issue.
They believe this narrative that Britain is the morally upstanding nation that does good in the world.
But also in relation to Northern Ireland, because for most of my adult life in Britain, there were bombs going up all the time. You know, the IRA were bombing people, and all over. You were not safe. It was a bit like what's happening now with, you know, other forms of terrorism. And yet, the story of the Troubles was not taught in schools in Britain. Were you taught about Northern Ireland? No, nobody's taught about Ireland. Yes, it's been the abiding 9/11 for, you know, for decades.
Yes,
so I think it's a way of managing politics.
Yes, it is. And it also helps explain why terrorism is now a Muslim thing. I mean, when I was growing up, every day we worried about my dad coming home from work because there were bombs going off all over London. You know, people were dying. And we've kind of reinvented terrorism as this thing that's unique to Muslims in post 9/11.
Well, Islam is a new racism, isn't it?
Yes, I mean, it is interesting when you look at the rhetoric around Muslims, and it is very reminiscent of the ways in which blackness was depicted in the press in the 80s and 90s. And I think that they, in some ways, Muslims have kind of become the new bogeyman, but people of Afro-Caribbean descent never stopped being the bogeyman either. So we're just adding more groups. And you know, and it's this visible otherness. Anybody who is visibly other is affected by the hostile immigration policy or the fears around terrorism.
But a lot of people in Britain say we don't see race. They will not talk about it because it's always like the stiff upper lip.
Yes.
That, you know, we do not, if you don't talk about it, maybe it will just sort of go away. We do know that race doesn't really exist.
Yes.
But do people accept that race doesn't exist? So there's just, I think it's not just a social, it's a political, economic construct.
If there's one thing I'm attacking with my book, it is the idea of I don't see race. And the reason I'm going after that is because in kind of polite society, liberal, well-meaning people who see themselves as part of the solution, it's a very common thing to hear. And I understand why people say they don't see race. What they're trying to communicate is I distance myself from racism, from prejudice. I don't want to be associated with that, which of course is good. The problem with it is, well, there are a few problems. One, we have been encouraged to believe that racism is a kind of set of personal characteristics that you can opt in or out of. So either I'm racist or I'm not racist. Race is a system, you know, race is a structure that has been developed over centuries to distribute advantage to certain groups. And by saying you don't see race, what you're saying is, I shut my eyes to the reality of this structural injustice that pervades every aspect of the society I live in. It means I don't see history, I don't see systemic racism, and I am opting out. And if you do that, you cannot be part of the solution. You are becoming part of the problem. And that's what I'm going at in my book, that these people who think that race is something that they can just step away from are actually a really good example of white privilege. You know, people like me don't get the option of not seeing race because we live it every day. We live it in our daily experience. We see it in the injustice, in the structural unfairness all around us. People who don't see race are enjoying their ability to blind themselves to something that has been going on.
But when you talk about a system, there are many elements to support the system, and I think it also supports class system, and it starts with the monarchy and the whole system of lords and ladies and the whole thing. Now, we've had this strange thing that I never thought would happen in my lifetime, that Prince Harry is not only marrying a commoner, but he's marrying a divorcee, an American, and, you know, she's got a single drop. So
she's got more than a single drop.
Yeah, so how does this affect, I mean, I'm not there, I don't know what it feels like. Do people like you feel that this may be a trigger for things changing, or?
I have been on the side of believing that there is some really useful symbolism around Meghan Markle. So I want to put this in perspective. So first of all, Britain considers itself a nation that's committed to fairness, social mobility, equality.
Liberal ideas.
Everything that the royal family is the polar opposite of, right? So The royal family is a total, it's a contradiction in terms. You know, the family that sits at the apex of the British state stands for everything the British state claims to be against. That's the first thing. So as long as you have a kind of leadership that's based on intergenerational wealth and privilege, you're not going to be achieving social justice. That's the first thing. So within that context, I've been quite positive about Meghan Markle. And the reason is this, I'm interested in identity. For me, growing up, Britishness was perceived as a white identity. So to be black and British was almost an oxymoron. And one of the institutions that solidified that in my mind was the royal family, because it's very difficult to get British people to agree on what it means to be British. But one thing many British people agree with is that the monarchy are the ultimate symbol of Britishness. And as long as they were totally white, they didn't hang around with black people, they didn't marry black people, they didn't even have black friends. You never saw a senior royal with a person of colour, other than in a kind of charitable setting where said person of colour was curtsying or kneeling before the monarch, which didn't exactly contribute to progress. The royal family kind of were white and also bound up very strongly in this idea of racial purity, which is also fundamental to the concept of the royal family. So, you know, the phrase blue-blooded that we use about the royals comes from the Spanish sangre azul, which means your skin being white enough that you can see the blue blood in your veins. So the royal family and racial purity go hand in hand. The reason I think Meghan Markle is useful is because symbolically it shows a generation that there is nothing intrinsically and necessarily white about the royal family. And it's not just her, you know, they might have children and their children will be children of colour with African heritage. And also the thing about Meghan Markle, which I find fascinating, is that I think if she were British, she would not have behaved the way she has.
But it wouldn't have happened if she were
Well,
British.
there are British people in the aristocracy. There are black people in the British aristocracy.
Not in the royal family.
Well, no, not in the royal family, but in the senior aristocracy, there are a couple. And if you analyse them, as I have for years, it's really interesting because they say, oh, I don't really see race. It's fine. I never really noticed. Kind of step away, nothing to see here. And it took someone like Meghan Markle, who's American, to be like, I'm biracial, my mother's African American. These are my experiences of racism. This is what race does to society. And I think that only someone from another country would have said that and would have owned that. And I think that sends a very powerful message, because one of my concerns about Britain, one of my concerns about the kind of diversity agenda in Britain, is that there is this very strong psychological pressure in Britain. If you are a person of colour who does access the establishment, when you get there, you're meant to keep your mouth shut. You're meant to assimilate. You're not meant to draw any attention to your difference, to your cultural heritage, to your blackness. It's very taboo. And I say this from personal experience, you know, someone who's been at the bar, who's been at the Guardian newspaper, who's been on TV News and Westminster, you know, who's studied at Oxford, the kind of traditional English establishment organisations. There are people of colour there, but they're very scattered and they keep their heads down and they don't draw attention to their difference. And that is the ways in which diversity becomes a total distraction, because you're bringing in people of colour to show that you have diversity, but you're not actually bringing in any diversity perspective. You're shutting down the diversity of experience that these people bring. And they're not free. They're not free to their expression of self-identity and cultural heritage. So that's what Meghan Markle is useful for. She is owning it, and a British person in her equivalent position would not have done that.
Well, I might say that you got a lot of stick from the British media for your book, because they say, how dare you? You're not working class, you've been privileged, you're half white, you went to Oxford, you went to good schools, how dare you complain?
Yes, the Daily Mail says that I am single-handedly fanning the flames of racial division in Britain, which is a huge compliment. I mean, who knew I had that much power, right? There is this narrative around gratitude in Britain. I am officially ungrateful. I am the ungrateful brown person. And gratitude is really interesting because white British people are not supposed to be grateful. I'm supposed to be grateful even though I've always been British, because I have been tolerated. And if you think about the words that British people use to speak about race, they use this word tolerance, which I find fascinating. Why are you tolerating me? You know, you're implying that there is a problem that you're willing to overlook. And that is the official word we use for talking about people of colour in Britain, that we tolerate them. And, you know, this is all linked to this idea of gratitude. Essentially, I've been tolerated, I've been let in, now I should be extremely grateful. And it's a really, really strong instinct in the British establishment to look at people like me and say, we let you in on the condition that you do not criticise us. And it's very revealing. It's very revealing.
Well, I think to be fair to the British, that's true everywhere. I think we expect all immigrants to be good
Yes,
immigrants.
but I'm not an immigrant.
No, but you look like an immigrant,
That's
so you
the
might as
problem.
well be.
Exactly.
Yeah. So
Exactly.
I think that notion that you've given something, somebody
Yes,
comes
I mean,
in
it's a
and you
generational
mustn't
thing.
err.
My grandmother, who came from Ghana when she was 20, will say to me, Afua, stop annoying the white people and just be grateful, I mean, and I get it. I respect her and her experience. And she came to Britain. She was conditioned with an imperial education. She was educated to believe that Britain was superior. That was by design, so that imperial subjects would be deferential. She then came to Britain and felt grateful for the ability to come to Britain because of what was going on in her country. And I get that. But this is where we make progress. I'm British. I'm not grateful. I am in Britain by right. And this is exactly what we're seeing with the Windrush generation. Now the government has admitted that they treated them appallingly. They're saying, and we're even going to let you have British citizenship. This is not a gift that you offer people. These are British people. And this is such a strong narrative in the British imagination, this idea of gratitude and of bestowing something through benevolence.
One of the things that surprised me in your book was the way in which Theresa May, the current Prime Minister, has been responsible in her previous role as Home Secretary for some of this injudicious regulation that has actually come now to bear upon these people. But in your book, you actually mention her in a different role.
Yeah.
Can you mention that?
Yeah, Theresa May is quite a complicated character because she actually was the first Home Secretary to openly criticise the police in Parliament. I don't know, I'm sure a lot of you here are familiar with the case of Stephen Lawrence, who is this black teenager who was murdered in 1993, and his killers were allowed to basically go free because of police corruption and because of institutional racism. And they weren't ultimately prosecuted. 2 of them prosecuted in 2012, but the other 3 remain at large.
But you know how they became prosecuted? Because the father of Stephen Lawrence was actually a mason or a builder.
Yes.
And he worked in the home of the
Data.
editor of the Daily Mail. And
Yes.
the Daily Mail we have 3 Daily Mail newspapers here. We don't actually have one like the Daily
We
Mail.
like to call it the Daily Fail.
It's a very
Yes.
middle class, popular
It is
publication.
a hub of rabid racism in Britain.
Yeah.
And it's also got the biggest distribution of any British newspaper.
And what happened was, because the editor came out and he made Stephen Lawrence's case, his personal
Yes.
case, and he came out, he actually published the face of these 4 white guys,
Yes.
which was totally wrong, because I mean it was contempt.
Yeah.
But he published the faces of these 4 white guys, and then white people said, well, if he says this and he's doing this,
Yes.
then there is something here. And this case has been running now 30 years or something, and it's
25.
the cause célèbre, really.
The Daily Mail, every time they do something overtly racist, which they do weekly, if not daily, say, but we're not racist because we did Stephen Lawrence. And what happened was that these 5 men went free because of police incompetence, corruption, racism, all of the above. And they also behaved appallingly. They behaved as if they had impunity, which we now know they did. And the Daily Mail published a headline with their 5 faces, and the headline said "murderers," and then underneath, "and if we're wrong, sue us," which was audacious and also contempt of court. But it was useful in radicalizing people that these murderers were going free. But it now turns out that the reason that the Daily Mail had done that, and the editor admits it himself, was only because Neville Lawrence, who's the Jamaican father of Stephen Lawrence, was his painter-decorator who'd done work on his mansion.
Yeah.
And
So
he seemed like a good, honest, hard-working man. And he said, had it not been for that personal connection, he would have had no interest in the case. And that, I think, is really interesting, because the Stephen Lawrence case is so layered, but there is a really strong good immigrant narrative to it. And I see this with the Windrush case as well. And the narrative is, Stephen Lawrence was beyond reproach, which he was. He was kind of a model pupil. He'd never been in trouble. He wanted to be an architect. He came from a very good, respectable Jamaican family. And a family who were able to advocate on his behalf and really take on the entire might of the establishment, which is remarkable. And it allowed people to say, he's one of the good ones. And so the fact that he was murdered by racists is really bad. And the question I always have is, what if he had been in trouble with the police? Does that make it okay? What about the Windrush? Everybody talks about how they contributed to Britain. They were invited, they built the country, they worked in public services, they're upstanding members of the community, all of which is true. What if they weren't? What if they hadn't run charities and become grandparents and worked in the NHS and paid taxes? They are British people. They deserve to be in Britain. And my concern with this rhetoric is that it sets a standard for good behaviour. And this good immigrant thing is very strong in Britain. If you are a person of colour who is descended from immigrants, you are expected to behave in a certain way. Your entitlement to the same Britishness that all other British people enjoy is conditional on your good behaviour. And that really worries me because it has very far-reaching consequences. And we all live it. We all live it. We all live this internal pressure that you must always be working twice as hard, doing half as much to fail. You have to be beyond reproach because if not, you might get deported.
Well, that's the same everywhere. But I want to open that up for discussion if anybody's got any questions. There's a microphone. And then
And welcome to Trinidad.
Thank
It's
you
nice to
so
have you.
much.
Yeah. I want to know, what do you feel about the Commonwealth in terms of all this? And from two sides. One, given everything that's happening with the Windrush, and also from the perspective of the Caribbean. I know you're not from the Caribbean and so on, but how do you view both the Caribbean and African countries that still participate in the Commonwealth and accept a lot that, they accept the status quo?
Yeah,
so
thank
to
you.
say.
That's a really good question. Thank you so much. Yeah, I like to call the Commonwealth the Empire 2.0, which really annoys people in Britain. But there's this incredible denial about the history of the Commonwealth. You know, one day it was the British Colonial Office, the next day it was the British Commonwealth Office. It's not complicated. It transferred into the Commonwealth. I see such strong imperial heritage in the Commonwealth, and this idea that everyone in the Commonwealth is equal is complete fallacy. And I think it was very powerfully demonstrated by the spectre of Caribbean heads of state asking Theresa May for a meeting while it emerged that people were being deported to their countries and her refusing to even meet with them until the press applied a kind of a critical mass of pressure. At the moment, there are 14 Caribbean nations suing Britain for reparations for slavery. Britain is using a legal loophole arising from the Commonwealth to block the case from those countries which are members of the Commonwealth. So you can see a level of contempt, in my view, for the African and Caribbean nations in the Commonwealth. If you look at Africa, Britain owns an area of land, so companies listed on the London Stock Exchange own an area of land 4 times the size of Britain in Africa and extract $1 trillion worth of natural resources from Africa every single year and don't pay taxes on them because of other tax loopholes elsewhere in the Commonwealth. This is a system that benefits Britain in the same way as the Empire benefited Britain. And when I say that, people say, yeah, but African and Caribbean countries want to be part of the Commonwealth. And that's true, you know, it's a voluntary organization. But the reality of empire is you create a system of dependence. You've created a system of global dependence. You've brought these countries into the globalized economy through the empire. And now their independence is also unsustainable without being part of a larger organization. So the idea it's a free choice is not true. And I think what I would like, I'm not saying abolish the Commonwealth because it's not up to me, it's up to the member states. But what I would like is some honesty. When it comes to the Commonwealth, there's talk at the moment of giving the Queen the Nobel Prize for her role in the Commonwealth. And look, you know, the Queen has worked very hard on the Commonwealth, don't get me wrong, because it's in Britain's interests. It is an organisation that allows Britain to sustain its wealth at the expense of its former imperial countries. So the idea of giving someone the Nobel Prize for doing something that is so massively in their interest, I just find baffling. But I think the reason is because of this amnesia. It's this sense that it's this genuinely kind of benevolent organisation that really exists to help these countries in the Caribbean and Africa when it's the opposite is true.
Thank you for your talk this morning.
Thank you.
I just want to mention a tiny bit of British amnesia. We need to check back in our history and see that Queen Charlotte was the Queen of Britain
Yes.
from Africa.
Yes, thank you. There's actually 2 queens who historians believe were of African heritage. Queen Philippa, who is a medieval queen, and Queen Charlotte. And that's one thing that's been useful about Meghan Markle, actually. It's brought this buried history to the surface. And it's attracted a new level of interest in it. So, I mean, this has just been systematically erased. 99% of British people don't know that, have never heard about it. And so people like me, and there are so many others now as well, who are writing, who are talking, who are teaching and researching on these subjects. So I do feel a change as well in the kind of the voices that are challenging that narrative.
But the British know that the royal family is not British. That
They don't know,
they do know,
No,
but
they
they don't care.
No, denial is a very powerful thing.
Yeah.
It's very powerful.
Thanks
Hello.
very much for your discussion. I just wanted to ask you, I think going back to the beginning, you talked about the moment when your book has come out being an important moment to challenge, or there's more of a culture where you can challenge some of these embedded discourses. And I just wondered how you felt about early writers like George Lamming's Pleasures of Exile, Sam Selvon's The Lonely Londoners, Carol Phillips's Colour Me English, Paul Gilroy's There Ain't No Black in the Union Jack. All those initiatives, not only by people, but by organizations, by black politicians, by Asian politicians in the 19th century, that have already, if you like, trodden this path
Yes.
to challenge
Yes,
these
and I
kinds
cite
of-
a lot of them in my book.
Yeah.
And I mean, it's, we are kind of standing on the shoulders of the work and the writing and the kind of mental space that they opened already. I think in my life, what's happened is that I came of age politically in the 1990s, and there was this sense that we kind of solved these problems. We had this new Labour government that said all the right things. We had this kind of optimism about globalization and the idea that you didn't need borders, and I think there was a huge complacency that saw people turning away from the work that had been done before. If you look at political blackness in Britain, I hear about this kind of mythical time when people of colour, black, Asian, African, Caribbean, all kind of considered themselves politically black and were united in this anti-racism. That fell apart in the 90s, I think partly because of a sense that it had won. And I don't think anyone involved in that struggle would ever say they had won, but there was the hostility of Thatcher in the 80s kind of gave way to this optimism, and it made people complacent. And I think that now people are going back to those writers again. I certainly am. I'm going back to Pan-Africanists from the 50s and George Padmore and Kwame Nkrumah, and I'm going back to the 19th century as well. And and also questioning, as you are, why we went backwards. This work has already been done. Why did we go backwards? Yeah, and I think that certainly one of the things I want to do is to try and kind of help build a trajectory so that we don't keep having to go back and learning the same lessons
Well,
over
many
again.
more people now are actually calling themselves, Black British or whatever they call themselves, and there's an enormous amount of mixing.
Yeah.
But do you ever think that the time will come when racism in Britain wouldn't exist?
I think everyone in Britain is very keen to say that Britain is post-racial, and my view is you cannot be post-racial until you've acknowledged the racialized extent of your reality. So Britain's trying to skip that whole phase of doing the hard work of looking at British history and British inequality and the ways in which race operate. They're just trying to bypass that and say we're all post-racial. Look at all these mixed race kids. And I'm saying that it doesn't work like that. You don't get to, you have to earn post-racial. You have to earn post-racial. We haven't even started because we're still in denial. So I would love for us to be in a future where these divisions no longer apply, but there is a lot of work to do.
One more question.
Hello.
First of all, I just want to say thank you, not just for the presentation today, but all the work that you've been doing. And I think that, I want you to know that you have an enormous fan base all over the world.
That's lovely.
Now, having said that, one of the issues that you become associated with is the call for people to begin to talk, to dialogue about unjust historical figures, like in the case of Lord Nelson in the UK. Well, we have all those unjust historical figures on plinths all across the Caribbean. We have Nelson in Barbados, here in Trinidad and Tobago we have Christopher Columbus. We have a highway that most of us would have arrived there on, named after Churchill. He's, of course, one of the unsung mass murderers of the 20th century. And when those of us in this part of the world raise these issues, and we're not just raising it at the question of removing the unjust figures, but also the question of the way that those unjust figures have sort of pushed our real heroes into oblivion. we get a lot of pushback and resistance. What would you say to those people who want to continue celebrating Nelson and Columbus and Churchill and characters like that here in the Caribbean?
Thank you for the question. My approach tends to be to meet the hysteria around these people with facts. You know, these are facts. I mean, I wrote a column drawing attention to the proven history of Nelson's views on slavery and the way that he used his position from his naval victories to advocate the continuation of the slave trade. And I was attacked personally. And the reason they attacked me personally is because they can't attack my argument, because it's just fact. I mean, it is fact. And I think that you have to kind of continue being relentless with your fact. And for me in Britain, one of the things that well, there's two things. It's really funny, actually. People say to me, they think I want to knock down Nelson's column. And actually what I'm saying is, let's start by just acknowledging what Nelson did. And they then say, imagine if British people went around the world destroying people's heritage because they didn't like it. And I was like, yeah, that's called the British Empire, dude. Welcome. So, and then I say, listen, British values are considered to be intellectual integrity and an interest in history. I am the only person being a true British person here. I am being honest about a set of facts about this historical figure, and you are all being hysterical, you know? So it's kind of, you've got to be the grown-up in the conversation, because other people, I don't know what, they are losing their minds, you know? But there is a serious undercurrent. To me, in Britain, the reaction to someone like me, I was on the front page of the tabloid newspapers for 3 days in a row when I wrote a column about the historical facts behind Nelson. And they were like, this is the woman who wants to destroy our history. Again, so powerful, who knew? I think it does show me that Britishness is in a very fragile place. White British identities are very fragile. So much so they cannot withstand basic debates based on facts, you know, and that is really revealing. And I think it is a bigger problem. So, you know, you kind of just got to know what you're going into and be fearless, you know, and it hasn't stopped me. If anything, it's made me more vocal, because when I wrote my book, if I'd have known this would happen, it would have been the perfect case study for what I'm arguing. These people are the perfect case study. The review of my book in the Times newspaper, which is the newspaper of record in Britain, it was written by a cricket reporter, first of all, and it included a line that said, I'm obsessed with weed.
You're obsessed with weed?
Yeah, there are no references to weed in my book. So I called my literary agent. I was like, I'm just checking this isn't some kind of literary phrase that I'm not familiar with. No, he just said, I'm obsessed with weed, because he looked at me and saw I'm a woman of colour and decided I'm obsessed with weed. And this is the newspaper of record in Britain. So that's what we're dealing with. That is the level of vitriol and irrationality and just malice, you know, that we're dealing with. And the only way, I think, to confront it is just to go higher. So
well,
keep doing what you're doing. Keep doing what you're doing.
I want to tell you, this book is extremely well written. We've had a conversation, but I recommend the book to you. It's full of facts. It's full of informed argument. And I think you learn quite a lot about contemporary Britain and a lot about history. And of course, you learn some of about your story. So thank you very, very much.
Thank you so much.
And I hope you enjoy the rest of the festival.
Thank you all for being a great audience. Thank you.